We have Dr. Muhammad Zaheer Abbas, and we will talk how to protect indigenous cultural and intellectual property. So we can see your presentation. And Muhammad is with us. You can unmute yourself, and thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Ola, for the introduction, and thanks for having me. I would like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land where QUT now stands. The topic of my presentation is new standalone legislation to protect First Nations, Indigenous, cultural, and intellectual property. So this is an overview of my presentation. We will talk about what are ICIPs, why we need standalone legislation. I will illustrate with the help of some case studies to make the case for a standalone legislation. Then there are some arguments against a standalone legislation. We will also address those arguments. Then what is the proposed framework? What are its elements? And then the concluding thoughts. So today, we are going to explore a topic that is not just a technical legal issue. It is a question of justice. It is about respect for the oldest living cultures on Earth. It is about correcting historical wrongs and shaping a fair future. It is about ensuring that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples have the right to control their cultural heritage, their knowledge systems, and their intellectual property. So, what do we mean by ICIP? It means indigenous cultural and intellectual property. It refers to all the rights that indigenous people have and seek to have to protect their traditional arts, knowledge, and cultural expressions. So, in the absence of adequate legal protections, indigenous knowledge has been repeatedly misappropriated, commodified, and exploited, often without consent, without benefit sharing, and without recognition. So, this causes profound harm. And it is not only economic harm, it is also cultural harm, it is also spiritual harm. It undermines identity and self determination. After decades of debate, Australia still does not have a comprehensive legal regime to protect ICIP. As a result, Indigenous artists and communities continue to experience unauthorized use of their designs, stories, and cultural expressions. According to the Productivity Commission, more than half of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander souvenirs sold in Australia are inauthentic. There have been some recent developments, both domestically and internationally, illustrating that things are heading in the right direction in the recent past. Through its national cultural policy called Revive, the Australian government committed in January 2023 to introduce a new standalone legislation to protect ICIP. For the first time, there is a clear political mandate to create a legal framework that reflects the unique nature of ICIP. This commitment reflects decades of advocacy from Indigenous communities, artists, and legal experts. Now, internationally, in May 2024, the World Intellectual Property Organization, WIPO, adopted the landmark WIPO Treaty on Intellectual Property, Genetic Resources, and Associated Traditional Knowledge. So, internationally, the adoption of the WIPO Treaty adds further momentum. Now, in terms of scope, ICIP is far broader than most people realize. It is not limited to the paintings displayed in galleries or the designs printed on souvenirs. It encompasses a vast and interconnected body of cultural heritage and knowledge systems that have evolved over more than 65,000 years. These include traditional cultural expressions such as art, music, dance, language, oral stories, and ceremonial practices. They also include traditional knowledge relating to land management, ecological sustainability, medicinal practices, agricultural techniques, and spiritual customs. It also includes knowledge of genetic resources, which is increasingly targeted by biotechnology and pharmaceutical industries. Now, what are the ICIP principles? ICIP is grounded in the principle of self determination. This principle means that indigenous peoples should have a meaningful say in how their culture is represented, used, and experienced by others. ICIP is not just about creativity or commerce, it is about identity, belonging, and relationships to land, to ancestors, and to community. Indigenous knowledge systems are not static, they are living, dynamic, and adaptive. They evolve in response to changing circumstances while remaining deeply rooted in country, community, and spirituality. Now, the Western IP frameworks are fundamentally different from ICIP. Western IP law assumes that creativity is individual rather than communal, that rights should be time limited rather than perpetual, that property is alienable rather than inalienable, and that law is universal rather than plural. These assumptions create a profound mismatch. Indigenous knowledge systems operate on principles of collective custodianship and cultural continuity. They are governed by customary law and embedded in spiritual and cultural values. They cannot be reduced to commodities. Existing copyright and trademark laws were never designed to protect ICIP. They failed to recognize collective ownership and the ongoing nature of indigenous knowledge. These laws cannot accommodate the communal, intergenerational, and spiritual nature of indigenous knowledge systems. Without dedicated legal protection, the integrity of indigenous cultural heritage will continue to be compromised, and the oldest living cultures on earth will remain exposed to systematic injustice. The case for standalone legislation is therefore clear. It is not just about closing legal gaps, it is about justice, respect, and reconciliation. It is about ensuring that the oldest living cultures are protected by laws that reflect their values and realities, not by frameworks that were never designed to protect them. Now, I'm going to discuss some case studies that show us what happens when ICIP is not properly protected. The first case study is in relation to the taro patent controversy in Hawaii. In 1999, the University of Hawaii filed three plant patent applications for new taro cultivars. These cultivars were resistant to a root rot disease and had distinctive pink, purple, and white combs. From a Western perspective, this was an innovation. It involved scientific research, investment, and technical expertise. It was patentable under the US patent law. But for Kainoka Maoli, the indigenous people of Hawaii, taro is not just a plant, it is a relative, it is part of their creation story. Taro is sacred, it is central to their identity, spirituality, and culture. When the patents were granted, uh, Kayanaka Maoli people protested. They argued that patenting taro was a violation of their cultural and spiritual rights. They demanded that the university should relinquish its patent claims. After years of controversy, the university filed terminal disclaimers, effectively surrendering the patents. This case illustrates the clash between Western IP systems and indigenous worldviews. It shows how patents can commodify life forms that are sacred to indigenous peoples. Now, the second case study is in relation to Manuka honey and the battle for using the name Manuka. Manuka honey is prized for its medicinal properties. It commands premium prices in global markets. but behind the marketing lies a struggle over names, identity, and rights. In New Zealand, Maori communities have long used manuka for healing. The word manuka comes from the Maori language. It refers to a plant native to New Zealand. As manuka honey became a lucrative commodity, disputes arose over trademarks and geographical indications. Australian producers sought to market honey as manuka, arguing that the plant grows in Australia too. Maori groups insisted that the name is theirs, that is part of their language and cultural heritage. The dispute over the name Manuka honey raised questions about who owns name Manuka, who controls its branding, and who benefits from its commercialization. The dispute ended with New Zealand producers losing their bid to secure exclusive trademark rights. This effectively means Australian producers can continue marketing honey as Manuka internationally. The decision of the Intellectual Property Office of New Zealand was followed by similar rulings in the UK, EU, and the US, where New Zealand groups also failed to secure exclusive rights. These rulings highlighted limitations of trademark law in protecting indigenous cultural heritage. Now, the third case study is Milpororo and Indofirm Proprietary Limited. This Australian case involved the unauthorized reproduction of sacred designs on carpets. These designs were taken from bark paintings created by indigenous artists. They were used without consent. They were sold in markets. They were walked on. The court awarded damages under copyright law, but the remedy was inadequate. It addressed economic harm, not cultural harm. It compensated the individual artists, not the community. It did not recognize the collective nature of indigenous culture. The fourth case study is Balloon and R&T Textiles Proprietary Limited. In Balloon case, the Federal Court of Australia dealt with unauthorized reproduction of an Aboriginal artist's paintings on textiles. The court recognized that the artist John Balloon had held copyright in the artwork. However, the community argued that the design was not merely an individual creation, it was part of a cultural system governed by customary law. To address this, the court acknowledged that Balloon owned a fiduciary duty to the community. This meant he had an obligation to act in community's interests when enforcing copyright. While this was a creative judicial attempt to bridge the gap between Western IP law and indigenous customary law, it was a workaround. It was not a full solution because the court's approach only patched the gap rather than creating a robust legal framework for ICIP. Now, there are some arguments against having a stand-alone legislation. The first argument is in relation to cost and complexity. Dedicated legislation is costly and administratively complex. Developing it requires extensive consultation, expert advice, and government resources. Its implementation may involve registration systems, dispute resolution, and enforcement mechanisms. Why not better enforce the existing laws? Now, the costs of not protecting indigenous cultural property are already substantial and ongoing. Indigenous communities lose millions of dollars annually to fake indigenous products. The economic harm of inadequate protection far exceeds the cost of developing and implementing a new legislation. Moreover, the legislation can be designed to be administratively efficient. For example, it could grant automatic protection without requiring registration or formal procedures. The second argument is in relation to duplication with existing IP law. Existing copyright, trademark, and design laws already address these issues. Adding another layer of protection creates duplication and confusion. Now, this argument can be addressed. The issue is not duplication, it is incompatibility. Stand-alone legislation would provide specialized protection tailored to indigenous needs. Existing laws do not provide this protection. Then the third argument is in relation to enforcement challenges. It is difficult to monitor and enforce rights across borders and online platforms. How can Australia stop overseas companies or prevent digital misuse? Enforcement seems impractical. Now, this argument can also be addressed. Enforcement challenges are real, but not a reason for non action or inaction. First, Australia can enforce legislation within its borders, prosecuting companies that import or sell fake indigenous products and restricting infringing imports. International enforcement mechanisms are expected to evolve over time. The World Intellectual Property Organization WIPO adopted its first treaty on traditional knowledge in May 2024, setting global standards. Member states are expected to incorporate these standards into national laws, creating enforceable obligations in due course. Digital enforcement is also possible. Platforms can be required to remove infringing content when notified. Indigenous communities themselves can monitor markets and take legal action when they have clear rights and accessible remedies. The fourth argument is about risk of government overreach. Legislation could allow government to control cultural matters that should be decided by indigenous communities. This concern can be addressed by designing the legislation to prioritize indigenous self determination. The solution is not to abandon legislation, but to structure it properly. The government's role should be enabling, not controlling, providing legal recognition and enforcement mechanisms for rights that indigenous communities define and assert. Now, the proposed framework has four key elements. The first element is creating a new indigenous knowledge right. The first and most fundamental element is the creation of a new intellectual property right that recognizes collective ownership of traditional knowledge and cultural expressions by the communities who are their custodians. Unlike existing intellectual property rights, this new right would not depend on originality or novelty, nor would it have a fixed term of protection. Instead, it would reflect the ancient, continuing, and evolving nature of indigenous heritage. Third parties wishing to use indigenous knowledge would need to obtain prior and informed consent and enter into appropriate licensing agreements to share both financial and non financial benefits. So, this will ensure benefit sharing, which is a fundamental principle of ICIP protection. The second element is the second element focuses on enabling the trade in fake indigenous products. Legislation would make it an offense to sell goods featuring indigenous designs unless they are made by Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people, unless they are produced under license from traditional owners, are clearly labeled as inauthentic. Labels should provide clear information at the point of purchase, and penalties should apply for misuse by non genuine businesses. Now, the third element proposes establishing a national indigenous knowledge authority, a dedicated body with statutory powers to protect and enforce indigenous knowledge rights in partnership with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. This authority would reduce the burden on traditional owners who currently face expensive legal action and complex negotiations. Its responsibilities could include negotiating licenses, collecting and distributing license fees, managing authenticity labeling, and initiating enforcement action against misuse. The fourth element is that legislation alone cannot ensure that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples derive real economic benefits from their cultural heritage. It focuses on practical support through government programs and capacity building strategies developed in consultation with First Nations peoples. This includes seed funding for training and infrastructure. Additional initiatives could include employment programs for Indigenous rangers to work with customs on detecting fake or inauthentic products. Oversight for such initiatives could be provided by existing agencies or by the proposed National Indigenous Knowledge Authority. Now, concluding key points, Australia stands at a crossroads. Our current intellectual property laws were built for Western concepts of individual authorship and time limited rights. They do not fit indigenous knowledge systems, which are collective, perpetual, and deeply cultural, intergenerational. This gap leaves Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples vulnerable to exploitation and denies them the economic benefits of their cultural heritage. We need standalone legislation laws that laws designed specifically for ICIP and grounded in principles of self-determination, free prior informed consent, and benefit sharing. They must ensure that indigenous communities control how their knowledge is used and have a share in the benefits. Effective legislation is more than legal compliance, it is about justice, reconciliation, and respect for the world's oldest living cultures. The proposed standalone legislation will create a future where indigenous knowledge is protected, valued, and celebrated. Thank you so much.